Hello, and welcome to the Adult Bible Study for the 9th of August, 2020. Today we're going to look from the Gospel of John, the 4th chapter, at the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. The title for today's lesson is Come and See, and it's a story about reaching out to others in an effective way to help them to encounter Jesus in a personal way. Come and see. It's kind of reminiscent of earlier in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is calling his initial disciples, and Philip interacts with Jesus and has his relationship begun with Jesus. And based on that, he goes immediately to Nathanael and he says, Nathanael, we have found him that Moses was talking about. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, and he's the son of Joseph. Nathanael, being like most of us are when we hear something like that for the first time, especially something as big as we have found the Messiah, was a little skeptical. And he says, Nazareth? What good ever came out of Nazareth? Philip says. He doesn't say, I'm not going to argue with you, but he doesn't argue with him. He just says, well, come and see. Come and see. You and I need to take that into account a little bit, I think, as we think about our interactions with other people in our attempts to share our faith and to be instruments of God's love and grace in this world. It's not about us convincing someone else. It's not about us debating someone else to the point where they have nothing to say back. It's not about us trying to convince them that they're wrong, and it's simply about us sharing with them the reality of our own faith, what God has done for us, and then saying, I don't know what God might do for you. I don't know what your relationship between you and God might produce, but come and see. And who knows? I believe you will experience a life-changing relationship. Well, that's what happens here. Jesus is traveling. Last week, we looked at Zacchaeus in Jericho. Jesus was passing through Jericho, and as he passed through, he encountered Zacchaeus up in that sycamore tree, and spent time with Zacchaeus, and it was a life-changing event for Zacchaeus. It's marvelous how Jesus was able to hone in on key individuals in these communities that he passed through. And certainly this woman at the well and Zacchaeus and Nicodemus were not the only people that he encountered in these communities, but they are representative of different groups in those communities. And in each case, Jesus produces for them the basis of a relationship that can grow and be something to share with other people. And all the people are blessed as a result of that. Well, Jesus has passed through Jericho, and he's on his way to Galilee. Now, from Jericho, he could have gone up the eastern side of the Jordan River and stayed out of Samaria, which is what most Jews would do, even though it was a longer route, just because of all the negative thoughts about Samaritans and all their ritual impurities and all the things that had transpired because of all the things that the northern kingdom had been through with the Assyrians overcoming them in 722. Remember us talking about those things, how the Assyrians' philosophy when they captured a people was that they didn't take them back to their cities necessarily, as much as they just dispersed them. They would leave some people in the area where they had been, people who would have understanding of crops and how to do things and how to adjust to that climate. But then they would also bring people in from other areas and plant them there. And so these people would have a while that they would take to get to know one another and to bond. And so for a few years at least, the Assyrians didn't have to worry about them being rebellious and joining together too quickly. Well, it worked for them in a way, but as a result, the Samaritans were considered second-class citizens by the Jews of the southern kingdom because they had been mixed with these people from other areas, and many of them had married people of other nations and other faith groups, and their faith was neutralized a little bit. They continued to worship Yahweh, but they also worshipped Baals and other gods too. It was just a hodgepodge of things that, while it included Yahweh and included some of the heritage from Yahweh, certainly their focus was on the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they didn't have a lot of the other things that had transpired since then. They didn't have the prophets of the pre-exile prophets and during the exile and the post-exile and all those prophets to gather from and to understand God's continuing relationship with the people. And so spiritually, they were kind of in a second-class position because they didn't have all this other heritage to build on. And their focus wasn't just primarily on Yahweh, it was on other gods too. And so the Jews really looked down on them and stayed away from them and saw them as kind of hopeless. Don't worry about those old Samaritans, they're just hopeless. They're just so lost and so wound up in their own things. Similar things that we might feel sometimes to some religious groups and others in our time, day and time. And yet, Jesus knew that there was a seed of faith there that he could build on. Anyway, to make a long story short, Jesus stops for the day at a well in a Samaritan city. His disciples go on to try to purchase some food for their evening meal, and Jesus stays there at the well. They're probably going to come back to the well because it's one of the few sources of clean drinking water and that sort of thing in an area that was very arid and dry, very inhospitable in other ways. And so Jesus stayed there, and they went to get food and bring it back. While he sat there in the afternoon, the hot part of the day, the weatherman said today that at 3 o'clock this afternoon it's going to be 95 degrees. Well, certainly considering that it starts out around 70, that's going to be significantly hotter than the morning. And so most of the people in that city were like we are. They got up early and they got out and they did the things they needed to do outside while the temperature was still fairly mild. And that was when people would gather. And the well, of course, was a community gathering place. Water is one of those essentials that everyone needs. And so everyone had to go to the well once or twice or maybe even more times a day based on how large their household was and how what kind of ability they had to transport the water back to their homes. But it was late in the afternoon, and there wasn't many people coming to the well right then. It was just so hot. It was one of those times of day when people hunkered down and stayed as cool as they could and did things that they could do in shelter and that sort of thing. And that was the time that this woman chose to go to the well. And that in itself gives us a clue to the situation that she was dealing with. She was an outcast. She was someone who wasn't an active part of the community because she was looked down upon. She'd been married several times. She didn't have a good reputation for any number of reasons, and because of that, she just didn't want to be around the other people. She knew all it would do was raise gossip and raise hard feelings, and it's better for her just to go during the heat of the day and gather her water. And she got to the well, and there was this Jew, and certainly she had seen Jews before. Jews did sometimes travel this way. This was a shorter route, and so some would probably go irregardless of all the other prohibitions and all the other things that would tend to make them hold back. But this Jew was different. This Jew looked her straight in the eye, and he says, "Can I have a drink of water?" "What? You want me to get you a drink of water? Pardon me, but where have you been?" Jews and Samaritans don't interact in that way. First of all, just the fact that you'd speak to me is kind of odd and unusual, and certainly that you would expect me to do something like that for you. Jesus, of course, was trying to engage this woman at a spiritual level. She, of course, was just like we are, very much caught up into the world, into the day and the tasks of the day. And her mind wasn't on high spiritual things at that moment. She was wanting to get some water and get back to the house because it was hot out there. Well, she just said, if you'd have known who it is that asks, you would have asked me to give you some water. For the water I have, when I give it to you and you take it, you'll never thirst again. Whoa, that sounds pretty good. I don't have to come to the well anymore, even in the heat of, certainly not in the heat of the day and that sort of thing. But of course, that's Jesus talking about spiritual things, the woman talking about physical things, trying to get the two coming together a little bit. She doesn't get it at first. It's kind of like in chapter 3 of John, where Nicodemus comes to Jesus in the evening and he asks all of his questions and stuff. And Jesus tells him, gives him a paradoxical statement. He says, you must be born again. And Nicodemus says, what? I can't be born again. I can't enter my mother's womb and be born again. And Jesus says, stop for a minute, Nicodemus. Think about this. We're not talking about physical birth. We're talking about spiritual birth. We're not talking about physical water. We're talking about spiritual water. That's what he's saying to the woman. And she begins to connect with that a little bit. And so she asks him a question. She says, well, what about our worship? You know, us Samaritans, we worship here. We have our own temple, and we worship Yahweh, and just like you Jews do. But what's going to, you know, where should I worship, and what should I do? Isn't that the way people do us when we share our faith? Don't they try to hit us with some unanswerable question? Well, how does your God feel about how all these terrible things are happening in the world these days? And why doesn't God do something about that? And why do people have to die and suffer? And all those questions that they use to dispel our spiritual meaning in our spiritual conversation. We don't answer those questions. We don't know the answer to those questions often. But we do know that God is the answer to those questions. And so we simply share the reason that we have hope and the reason that we have faith. And Jesus shares with her. He says, you know, the day's coming when people, it won't matter where you worship. It won't matter whether you worship here in Samaria or whether you go to Jerusalem, because God's not worried about where you're at. He's worried about why you're there. The spirit of your worship. He's looking for those people who can worship him in spirit and in truth. And that really hits home to her. That makes sense. Of course, why would God care where the building was that I worship in? For God is everywhere. And it's about God and I having a relationship. That's a pretty radical idea for someone in Jesus' day and time anyway, to think that God would want to have a personal relationship with me, not just my nation and my people as a whole, but with me as an individual. That's one of the key things that Jesus is saying in his witness and testimony and teaching, is that each and every one of us are important to God. And he loves each and every one of us for who we are. The woman says, yes, give me this water to drink. She opens her heart and life to Jesus, and she receives his forgiveness, his grace. It makes a difference in her life right away. It makes such a difference that suddenly she's not worried about water that much anymore at all. She leaves her water basin there, and maybe for Jesus to have access, continued access to water, maybe just because suddenly something even more important than just a drink of water has happened to her. and she's just bursting at the seams to share it. And she goes into town, and here is this woman who was so ostracized from the other people that she shirked around in the shadows, and she came to the well at the time of day when no one else would be there. Here is this woman going and encountering other people and saying, listen, I just met someone at the well. He is the Messiah. He is the one. He told me things that no one else could tell me. He has forgiven me. Come and see for yourself. Come and see. And she had such excitement and such joy and such authenticity about what she was saying that others came to see. And because they came to see, others entered into a relationship with Jesus too. Out of this one person came a whole village coming to that well. And again, remember, it's still the hot part of the day when people wouldn't choose to come on their own, but they were driven by their need and by their hunger to know God's grace and love. People in our world are hungry also to know God's grace and love. And the people responded, not to the woman. God doesn't call you and I to be the one who takes people through the transition of salvation. God does that. That's God's work. It's not for you and I to convict others of their sin. That's God's work. Jesus knew that this woman's life was not pure, but he didn't confront her with that to begin with. Instead, he confronted her first of all with her spiritual need. You need living water. And now that you have that living water, now you can look at things in a different light. And he lets her know, that's one thing that we as Christian people fall a little short on. We're so scared of being judgmental of others that we just gloss over the things that we know are really causing pain and hurt in others. And there's a way to do that and a way not to do that. And unfortunately, we've not been real good in doing it the correct way. We tend to judge, we tend to put down, we tend to be real negative towards people. Jesus says first there is that relationship. First you receive the living water. And then as that water bubbles up and brings new life into your being, into your existence, you will see the error of your ways. You will see those untruths. You will be able to hear when someone says, do you realize that when you do that, you're really not only hurting yourself, but you're hurting others around you? And they can hear it not as a blaming, judgmental, negative kind of thing, but they can hear it because they hear it through the ears of faith, and they hear it in the sense of wanting to do better, wanting to be more like God wants them to be. And that matters to them now, where before it didn't matter at all. So what? I don't care what you think. You take what you think and go do whatever you want to do with it. But I don't have to change just because you think I need to change. And yet they're right. They don't have to change just because we think they need to change. But God can change them. And God will change them. And these people in that village were changed. They became not only open to a Jew, but they invited Jesus to stay a couple of days, saying, oh my, wouldn't you have loved to have been in that town during those 2 days to sit and listen to Jesus as he talked with those people, as he answered their questions, as he gave them examples and used his parables and teachings. Unfortunately, we don't have any of his teachings from that 2-day period, but it was a wonderful 2 days, I'm sure. And many people came to faith. Many. Some had started their faith walk because of the woman's testimony. Some had come just out of curiosity. Some had come out of need. All were made whole, that received Jesus and responded to his gift of grace. Come and see. What a wonderful message. As you and I go through our lives as Christian people, may we share the wonderful things that God has done for us in our lives and share them in such a way that it can be encouraging for others to want to come and see as well. God bless you in this week ahead as you struggle to be that person that he created you to be, as you struggle to allow that living water to bubble up in your life and effervesce over and touch the lives of others around you. And it will happen if you'll let it, if you'll respond to God's grace and love and allow him first to touch you and then through you to touch others. We but give testimony to how great God is. Our God is an awesome God, and he reigns not only in heaven above, but in all the earth. And when we receive him as King, we have received a gift beyond any riches, anything that this world has to hold. We'll be like that woman at the well. We'll put down our water jug and not be so worried about money or about enjoying things or fun things or all that. Won't be the focal part of our lives anymore, but rather our lives will have meaning and truth and wholeness because we know God and we know what it is to be his people. God bless you. Have a great week. Amen.